great Max Perutz, right, who won a Nobel Prize for his incredible insights into hemoglobin, even he went to the grave fighting views on hemoglobin, and his views were by no means accepted. That's perhaps not so well known. Those in the know that there are aspects to the story that remain to be understood, and those aspects couldn't be fully understood within the simple frameworks that most of us can regurgitate. So hemoglobin has been a battleground of science for many, many a year.
The oxygen in the air we breathe is exposed to the red cells in our lungs.
Yes.
The red cells carry the oxygen to the tissues because the red cells contain hemoglobin.
Now let's look at that hemoglobin for just a moment. That is a word made up of two parts, hemo and globin. And the hemo means blood, and the globin comes from the word globulin, which means the protein materials in the blood.
There are discoveries, right, that lead one to understand that red cells are important for oxygen delivery. And that was a very early discovery because people could see red blood cells. And they investigated that and found that hemoglobin was the player important in the delivery of gases. It would release oxygen, it would release carbon dioxide. It was really a simple extrapolation then that giving back red blood cells would make people better. There's something really missing in this biology.
The simplicity of just taking liquid from one individual and entering into another clearly is not simple at all.
One of the great fallacies that's occurred in medicine all around this religion of blood transfusion is that by giving a unit of red blood cells, one improves oxygen delivery to the tissues. When we transfuse a unit of red blood cells, the tissue delivery of oxygen to critical organs actually drops. It becomes worse rather than better.
Max Perutz did say that science is truth, and he has had an enormous impact on the way I think. I think all the time that there is no chance that I can trick nature here. We like to say that the respiratory cycle is really a three-gas system. The Handbook of Respiratory Physiology, the classic text, will include our model of a three-gas respiratory cycle. So we missed a gas. Hemoglobin doesn't just ferry oxygen from lungs to tissues and CO2 back, carbon dioxide back to the lungs, but it carries this third gas, nitric oxide, in a protected form, and it releases the nitric oxide together with oxygen. The nitric oxide then dilates the blood vessels so that the oxygen can get to the tissues. What turns out is that our blood banks are deficient in nitric oxide. When you store blood in the blood bank, the red cells lose their nitric oxide, and they are therefore unable to dilate blood vessels, and oxygen delivery to tissues is thereby impaired. So the world's blood supply is deficient in nitric oxide, and those red cells do not seem able to deliver oxygen in the same way as a fresh red blood cell is capable of.
When you cut your finger, you start bleeding. That blood, if you just let it drip, will at some point coagulate. Understanding the coagulation system is a mystery. How does the coagulation system know only to clot at the point of injury and not clot throughout? Not only do we not understand the intricacies of this system, but in fact, we're just now starting to understand that the coagulation cascade and looking at very simplistic diagrams of how the coagulation system is activated, through which every physician and nurse has to learn by heart, it probably doesn't exist in nature, and we know probably just the tip of the iceberg.
Hay riesgos de infección, sobre todo en la transfusión de plaquetas, que no han podido ser minimizados a pesar de todo el cuidado que se ha tenido y todo el rigor con que se trata la sangre. Y hay riesgo en este momento de inmunomodulación, cuya magnitud desconocemos porque probablemente se van a ver a lo largo de los años, en años más.
Scientists looked at patients that were transfused for orthopedic surgery, so they had no other comorbidities. And those transfused for this particular surgeries, 10 years later, had an increased incidence of lymphoproliferative disease. They had lymphomas. The surgeons don't care what will happen 10 years later to their patient because they're not going to see him. I think this knowledge should be given more and more to the clinicians to realize that it's not just the immediate effect that they're seeing, that there are side effects that may come along much later. That's another reason that we should be very cautious about transfusion and only use it if it's really life-saving.
In America, we must make doubly sure no person is held to account for a crime he or she did not commit. So we are dramatically expanding the use of DNA evidence to prevent wrongful conviction.
One of the underappreciated facts about blood transfusion is that if you get my blood, you will now have my DNA. There's some fascinating data that has come out in the last 10 years, where a group of physicians took a look back at World War II veterans who were transfused during World War II. And guess what? A significant percentage of them, over 25%, actually had DNA from a different person circulating in their body. There's been a number of studies shown that if you give a blood transfusion without reducing out the white cells, and still in the United States, 50% of our blood is given without reducing the white cells, you will become what is called a chimera. You will become a blended animal. You will no longer be a single, distinct human being. You will be a multi-DNA'd animal carrying somebody else's DNA. How long, we don't know, but it's fascinating from the World War II group of veterans that still, some 50 years later, they still carry the DNA of the person that they were transfused from. We know today that a number of rare diseases are carried in your DNA. Your propensity for getting lymphoma, leukemia, something else, cancers may be affected by this. Your transmission of this may lead to any number of other diseases moving through a population. It's never been studied, nor do we have the foggiest notion about the effect of blood transfusion on what we call the epigenetics, the movement of these genes through a population.
Unlike marriage, transfusion is for life, and there is some data showing that women who have no Y chromosome, since women have two X's, any of the white cells that are detected in their bloodstream devoid of any Y chromosome, yet after being transfused for hemorrhage, you can detect these Y chromosomes now because some of the units of blood they received were from male donors. You can detect these units of blood in the Y chromosome in the circulating blood of these women for years after the transfusion. We assume that because of the ability of white cells to reproduce since they have DNA, the recipient has a signature from the donor for life in their bloodstream. The clinical implications clearly are yet to be determined.
Say money. Money.
Englewood Hospital and Medical Center is celebrating a major achievement. It's been awarded a nearly $4.7 million Defense Department grant to teach military doctors what it knows about bloodless medicine and surgery.
We were contacted by the Special Ops, both Air Force and Navy, to help in terms of what they found out or knew is that we were able to treat patients for whom blood was not an option with great success despite the very low hemoglobins they had.
Я понимаю после беседы с вами, что и в Америке, и в России есть врачи, ретрограды, которые за то, чтобы переливать кровь. И есть те прогрессивные, которые говорят, что надо все больше и больше отказываться от переливания крови. А критерии к этому, наверное, да не наверное, это точно, и у вас, и у нас сейчас одни и те же, которые вытекают из доказательной медицины, что надо отказываться от переливания крови.
Medicine is based upon a risk-benefit ratio. Every decision I make as a physician should, you would think, be based upon my in-depth weighing of the evidence of I'm going to do more good than harm if I take the following therapy. You know, the standard Hippocratic oath is do no harm. First, doctor, do no harm.